They captured Earth's Biologist, then wondered why the war suddenly shifted. The recruitment station on Luna Base 3 processed human resources with algorithmic precision. Representatives from 17 worlds conducted assessments that would determine humanity's role in the galaxy's greatest conflict. The process was clinical, designed by minds that understood war as mathematics rather than survival. Dr. Eli Monroe stood behind enhanced soldiers and augmented pilots, their neural implants sparking with confidence. At 25, he possessed no cybernetic enhancement or military training, only a doctorate in evolutionary biology and scientific curiosity his professors called dangerously theoretical. The Galactic Alliance needed bodies for their war machine. Earth provided them, eagerly desperate to prove humanity's worth in a cosmos that had written them off as minor players. The selection algorithm was precise combat roles for the strong technical positions, for the enhanced research assignments for the brilliant. Eli fell through every category. Too fragile for combat, too unaugmented for complex systems, too theoretical for practical research. In galactic warfare's vast machinery, he was classified as miscellaneous, a spare part without clear function. Next, called the Thacarian assessor, multiple eyes examining Eli's file with professional disinterest. Dr. Eli Monroe, evolutionary biology. The assessor's analysis was clinical. Educational credentials suggest research classification, but practical applications, insufficient. I study how species adapt under extreme pressure, Eli offered, how life survives when everything else fails. Survival adaptations. The assessor's tone carried amusement. Perhaps xenological survey work. But processing had moved beyond individual preferences. The Alliance needed bodies for dangerous missions, not theoretical scientists for laboratories. A clerical error, a single-digit transposition redirected Dr. Eli Monroe from research stations to frontline combat. None realized they had just made the most important mistake in military history. The transport Convergence delivered its human cargo to Coalition Forward Base Septimus with freight-like efficiency. Dr. Eli Monroe disembarked into a world where air hummed with alien technologies and background radiation from weapons that could crack moons. Around him, species from across the galaxy moved with incomprehensible purposes, some floating like living clouds, others skittering on appendages that defied biological classification. Forward Base. Septimus existed where 17 different understandings of warfare intersected. The Quarthak brought kinetic bombardment mastery. The Veltar contributed electronic warfare expertise. Even ethereal Wisperi offered their unique phasing abilities for reconnaissance. And then there were humans, newest coalition members, still learning to operate where breathable atmosphere was luxury rather than necessity. Commander Varnek surveyed the latest arrivals with predatory assessment. His species had evolved from apex predators, psychology shaped by millions of years of successful hunting. Standing nearly 3 meters tall with deflecting exoskeleton and sensory organs, tracking movement across kilometers, he represented everything humanity was not. Another batch of Earth spawn! He growled to his aide using the derogatory term common among coalition forces. Engineers, pilots, soldiers, acceptable. But what is this? His clawed appendage gestured toward Eli, who stood awkwardly in ill-fitting combat gear, examining local flora with scientific interest, colorful organisms that were actually parasitic life forms capable of stripping organic matter from bone in minutes. Dr. Eli Monroe, classified as support personnel, evolutionary biology specialization. Biology. Varnek's 4 eyes focused on Eli with predatory attention. What use is primitive life study in a war fought with quantum weapons? The answer would transform the galaxy. But for now, Eli was simply another human assigned to non-essential support functions. Translation, stay out of the way, while qualified personnel handled actual fighting. Orientation was designed for efficiency, not comfort. Information came too fast in too many formats. Holographic battle formations, audio presentations in barely detectable frequencies, tactical simulations requiring neural interfaces humanity didn't possess. Questions? Asked the briefing officer, a Zentarian whose multiple limbs moved with mechanical precision. Eli raised his hand, earning looks of surprise from the other humans. The enemy bioweapons mentioned in the tactical overview, what's their replication cycle, how do they adapt to environmental changes? The silence that followed was broken by what might have been laughter from several non-human species. The concept that biology could be tactically relevant was so foreign that most of the audience assumed Eli was making some form of primitive human joke. Dr. Monroe, the briefing officer, replied with professional courtesy, "Biological considerations are handled by specialized AI systems. Your assignment will focus on other duties." Those other duties, as it turned out, involved the kind of work that kept coalition forces operational, but never appeared in strategic reports. Equipment maintenance, supply distribution, the endless tasks that formed the invisible foundation of military operations. Work that was necessary, but unremarkable, performed by people whose contributions were measured in the absence of problems, rather than the presence of victories. But as Eli settled into his assigned role, something nagged at the edge of his scientific consciousness. The casualty reports from recent engagements showed patterns that didn't match conventional military doctrine. Enemy forces were adapting to coalition tactics with a speed that suggested something beyond simple learning algorithms. The adaptation was organic evolutionary, the kind of rapid change that only occurred in biological systems under extreme selective pressure. And in the margins of official reports, he began to notice references to things that the tactical AIs couldn't classify enemy weapons, that seemed to grow rather than being manufactured defensive systems that healed damage instead of simply absorbing it, strategies that evolve between battles like living organisms. The galaxy's greatest military minds were fighting a war using principles of physics and engineering. But what if they were actually facing an enemy that understood biology? The mess hall was a study in controlled xenophobia, disguised as professional efficiency. Species clusters formed along evolutionary lines, carbon-based lifeforms, in one section, silicon-based entities requiring different atmospheres, energy beings, flickering in appropriate electromagnetic spectra. At the edges, humans sat in small groups, learning to navigate social dynamics, spanning entirely different concepts of consciousness. Dr. Eli Monroe ate alone, isolated from engineers and pilots who possessed skills the coalition found useful. He was neither combat trained nor enhanced, neither strategically valuable nor tactically relevant. In military hierarchy, he ranked below medical supplies. "The Earth-spawn biologist sits by himself," observed Lieutenant Rylus of Veltar, whose neural tendrils crackled with electrical energy. Her species had evolved from pack hunters, and isolation marked Eli as weak, selected for elimination. "Perhaps he fears contamination from superior species," suggested her companion, scales shifting to contempt purple. Commander Varnek, observing from the senior staff table, felt disgust. Warriors earned respect through competence under pressure. The weak were cold in environments demanding excellence. That humans produce such inadequate specimens suggested fundamental evolutionary flaws. "What exactly does the creature do during duty cycles?" Varnek asked his aide, using the pronoun that his language reserved for non-sentient organisms. "Equipment cataloging mostly. He's been assigned to inventory biological specimens collected from contested zones. The assumption is that even a primitive intelligence can sort organic matter into categories. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that Eli's cataloging work had given him access to materials that were providing crucial insights into enemy capabilities. Every tissue sample, every genetic fragment, every preserved organism told a story about biological warfare techniques that the Coalition's tactical AIs couldn't recognize because they had been programmed to think like machines rather than living creatures. The specimens spoke of evolutionary acceleration beyond natural limits, of genetic modifications that achieved in days what should have required millennia. They revealed technologies that used DNA as software and cellular structure as hardware weapons that grew, rather than being manufactured defensive systems that adapted through genetic expression rather than mechanical adjustment. But Eli's reports were filed under miscellaneous biological data, and ignored by command staff who couldn't conceive that the study of primitive life forms might have military applications. His careful analysis of enemy adaptation patterns was dismissed as academic speculation inappropriate for tactical planning. The human continues to submit reports about cellular structures and genetic sequencing, his supervising officer noted during routine briefings. Perhaps someone should explain that we're fighting a war, not conducting a research symposium. The laughter that followed was universal among species that had long since transcended biological limitations. What use could the analysis of organic matter possibly have against enemies wielding weapons that operated beyond the 3 dimensions of normal spacetime? That contempt would prove to be the Coalition's greatest tactical error. During his off-duty hours, Eli found himself drawn to the observation decks, where reinforced transparent barriers provided views of the contested star system beyond. Through those barriers, he watched enemy fleets move with patterns that reminded him of cellular mitosis, of evolutionary algorithms playing out across galactic distances. Their formations didn't just adapt to Coalition tactics, they evolved, developing new responses through what appeared to be genuine biological learning. Fascinating view, isn't it? The voice belonged to Captain Lyra, a Quellian, whose species had achieved spaceflight while still maintaining biological forms remarkably similar to baseline humanity. Unlike most Coalition officers, she didn't seem to regard humans as evolutionary failures. "The enemy formations," Eli said, pointing toward distant flashes of weapons fire. "They're not following mechanical patterns. Look at how they respond to our attacks. It's like watching immune system responses. Attack adaptation, counter adaptation. You think they're alive? I think they're using biological principles in ways we don't recognize. Our AIs keep trying to predict mechanical responses, but what if we're fighting something that thinks like a living organism rather than a computer?" Captain Lyra studied the display with renewed interest. Among the Quellians, biological intuition was considered a legitimate form of intelligence, not a primitive relic to be transcended. "Have you reported these observations?" "Multiple times. Command says biological analysis is outside my assigned duties." The irony was lost on neither of them. The Coalition possessed the most advanced artificial intelligences in galactic history, quantum processors that could model the behavior of entire star systems, strategic planning algorithms that incorporated variables across 17 different dimensions of tactical analysis. But they had become so focused on technological superiority that they had forgotten the most fundamental principle of warfare: know your enemy. And their enemy, it was becoming clear, knew them very well indeed. The attack came at 0347 Standard Galactic Time during quiet rotation when biological species experience sleep cycles. Forward base. Septimus's defensive systems registered incoming assault 4.3 seconds before first contact, insufficient for traditional evasion, but adequate for automated responses that had protected Coalition installations for decades. What happened next redefined their understanding of biological warfare. The enemy weapons weren't traditional projectiles or energy beams. They were living organisms, creatures engineered for destruction that moved with purpose through defensive perimeters. Traditional shields designed for particle beams and kinetic rounds proved ineffective against attackers that could phase through solid matter, adapt cellular structure to absorb energy weapons, and coordinate with hive mind precision. In command, every tactical AI ran simultaneous analyses, searching for conventional military logic that didn't exist. Attacks followed no recognizable doctrine, used no identifiable technology, operated according to principles outside Coalition databases. Status report? Commander Varnek demanded tracking displays showing defensive positions crumbling under assault from enemies that shouldn't exist. "Defensive grid failures across 17 sectors," reported his tactical officer. Attackers appear to utilize biological phase shifting capability, weapons achieving minimal effectiveness. "Biological." Varnek's voice carried the same tone he would have used to discuss theoretical physics. "Define parameters." "Unknown. The organisms demonstrate characteristics that don't correspond to any recorded life forms. They're adapting to our countermeasures in real time." While Command struggled to categorize enemies refusing to behave according to established doctrine, Dr. Eli Monroe was experiencing his own confrontation with biological warfare. The attack caught him in specimen storage, surrounded by tissue samples and genetic materials that suddenly took on terrifying significance. Watching attackers flow through corridors like living liquid, he recognized something Coalition AIs missed. These weren't random biological weapons. They were evolutionary experiments, creatures designed according to principles he'd studied throughout his career. "Their attack patterns," he breathed, observing through security monitors. "They're following cellular division protocols. Look they split when encountering resistance combine when needing concentrated force. They're thinking like biological systems. Around him, advanced military equipment proved useless against enemies operating according to evolutionary logic. Weapons designed for traditional armor were ineffective against creatures redistributing damage across cellular structure. Energy shields meant to deflect projectiles offered no protection against organisms altering molecular composition to phase through barriers, but Eli saw patterns reminding him of every biological defense mechanism studied. The attackers were sophisticated, but still organic entities, and organic entities followed fundamental rules. "They have a life cycle," he said urgently. "Everything biological has a life cycle." His fingers moved across the facility's research terminals, accessing databases that contained decades of captured enemy genetic material. The information was there, buried in files that no one had considered tactically relevant cellular reproduction rates, metabolic requirements, genetic stability parameters. In his mind, training in evolutionary biology began constructing models that had nothing to do with combat doctrine and everything to do with understanding how living systems operated under stress. The attackers were formidable, but they were paying a metabolic cost for their capabilities. Enhanced phase shifting required cellular energy expenditure that had to be replenished. Rapid adaptation created genetic instability that compromised structural integrity over time. "Emergency broadcast to all coalition forces," Eli announced over the communication system, his voice cutting through the chaos of battle reports and tactical updates. "The biological attackers have a 47-minute operational window before cellular degradation begins. Avoid direct engagement and wait for metabolic exhaustion." The silence that followed was broken by Commander Varnek's voice carrying disbelief and barely controlled rage. "Who authorized the Earthspawn to use command communications? This is Dr. Eli Monroe, and I'm telling you that these organisms are operating beyond their sustainable metabolic limits. They're burning cellular energies at rates that will cause system failure in less than an hour. You don't need to defeat them, you need to survive them." It was the kind of advice that violated every principle of military doctrine. Warriors attacked enemies, they didn't hide from them. Superior civilizations with advanced technology didn't retreat from primitive biological weapons. The suggestion was insulting to species that had conquered star systems through technological superiority. But as the battle continued, something unprecedented began to happen. Coalition forces that followed Eli's advice units that focused on evasion rather than engagement, that treated the attackers as temporary biological phenomena rather than permanent military threats, began reporting decreased casualties. The biological weapons, for all their sophistication, were indeed burning out. Their cellular structures, pushed beyond sustainable limits by their enhanced capabilities, began showing signs of metabolic collapse. Creatures that had seemed invincible 40 minutes earlier were dissolving into organic sludge as their genetic modifications proved too unstable to maintain. By Aero 5:30, standard galactic time, the attack was over. Not because the coalition had achieved military victory, but because the enemy's biological weapons had exhausted their operational parameters exactly as Eli had predicted. In the aftermath, as damage reports revealed that casualties among units following the evacuation protocol were 73% lower than those that had engaged directly, Commander Varnek found himself confronting something that challenged his fundamental understanding of warfare. A human with no military training had demonstrated tactical insight superior to the coalition's most advanced artificial intelligences. A biologist who studied primitive life forms had recognized patterns that quantum processors had missed entirely. How was all he could manage when he finally confronted Eli in the wreckage of the specimen storage facility. "Biology," Eli replied simply. "Everything alive has limitations. You just have to know what to look for." 3 weeks after the biological assault on Forward Base, Septimus intelligence reports began painting a picture that terrified the coalition's strategic planners. The enemy wasn't just using biological weapons, they were perfecting them. Each attack showed evidence of evolutionary improvement creatures that incorporated lessons learned from previous encounters. The enemy was using organic evolution as their research and development program, turning warfare itself into a selective pressure that produced increasingly deadly biological weapons. Dr. Eli Monroe had been quietly promoted to Special Biological Consultant, a position that officially didn't exist, but which gave him access to intelligence materials that were reshaping his understanding of the conflict. The enemy, whoever they were, possessed technologies that could accelerate evolutionary processes by millions of years in a matter of weeks. They were essentially farming weapons, cultivating biological instruments of destruction with the same precision that traditional civilizations manufactured starships. The realization filled him with a species of terror that went beyond mere fear of death. As an evolutionary biologist, he understood the implications of weaponized evolution better than anyone else in the coalition. If the enemy could perfect their biological weapons through repeated exposure to coalition defenses, there would eventually be no counter-strategy that could succeed, unless someone could find a way to turn evolutionary pressure against the enemy itself. The opportunity came during what military historians would later call the Battle of the Kepler Nebula, a massive engagement where the coalition's combined fleets found themselves trapped in a stellar phenomenon that limited their mobility, while offering the enemy unprecedented tactical advantages. It was by any military measure a hopeless situation. Commander Varnek stood on the bridge of his flagship watching as enemy forces deployed biological weapons that had clearly evolved beyond anything the coalition had previously encountered. These new creatures were immune to energy-based attacks, could survive in hard vacuum, and demonstrated coordination that suggested collective intelligence on a galactic scale. Strategic options he requested from his tactical staff. Limited came the response from multiple species simultaneously. The Draconoids recommended immediate retreat. The Veltar suggested attempting to break through enemy lines using concentrated firepower. The AIs calculated probability matrices that showed inevitable defeat regardless of tactical approach. Request permission to attempt biological countermeasures. Came a voice from the communication system, Dr. Eli Monroe, transmitting from the Coalition research vessel, Synthesis, that had accompanied the fleet to study captured enemy materials. Denied, Varnek replied automatically. Biological analysis is not a combat discipline. Commander. Eli's voice carried an urgency that transcended military protocol. I've been studying the evolutionary patterns of their weapon systems. I think I can turn their adaptation process against them, but it requires direct exposure to the enemy bioweapons. The bridge fell silent as the implications became clear. Direct exposure to biological weapons that had evolved specifically to kill coalition personnel was effectively a request for permission to commit suicide. Explain your methodology, Varnek ordered. The enemy weapons adapt through genetic recombination during combat, but evolutionary pressure is bidirectional. If I can introduce genetic material that forces their organisms to adapt in self-destructive directions, their own evolutionary mechanisms will eliminate them. And the probability of your survival? Irrelevant. The genetic material I'll be carrying is designed to trigger cascade failures in their adaptive systems. Even if I don't survive the exposure, the countermeasure should propagate through their biological network. Captain Lyra's voice joined the communication from her cruiser on the fleet's periphery. Eli, what you're describing is biological suicide. What I'm describing is using their greatest strength against them. They've turned evolution into a weapon, but evolution is still evolution. And evolution can be guided by someone who understands the principles involved. The silence stretched across the fleet as commanders from 17 different species contemplated something unprecedented, allowing a non-combat specialist to attempt a tactical solution that no artificial intelligence could model or predict. Permission granted, Varnek announced, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that violated every principle of military command structure he had ever learned. What followed would be studied in tactical academies for generations. Dr. Eli Monroe, equipped with genetic materials synthesized from his analysis of captured enemy weapons, allowed himself to be captured during what appeared to be a scouting mission gone wrong. Coalition forces watched helplessly as enemy biological weapons engulfed the research shuttle, expecting to witness the death of the human biologist, who had somehow become critical to their survival. Instead, they observed something that redefined their understanding of biological warfare. The enemy weapons that absorbed Eli began exhibiting behavior patterns that had never been recorded. Instead of simply killing their target, they started consuming genetic material that had been specifically designed to trigger evolutionary instabilities. The biological weapons, following their programmed adaptation protocols, incorporated the genetic sequences into their own structures, and then they began to die. not from external attack, but from internal genetic collapse. The countermeasures Eli had developed forced the enemy weapons to evolve in directions that were unsustainable, creating biological paradoxes that their cellular structures couldn't resolve. Within minutes, creatures that had seemed invincible were dissolving as their own adaptation mechanisms turned against them. The effect propagated through their biological network, like a genetic plague reaching organisms throughout the enemy fleet. Biological weapons that had been perfected through millions of years of accelerated evolution were suddenly failing as their genetic programming led them into evolutionary dead ends. When coalition forces finally retrieved Dr. Eli Monroe from the wreckage of the biological assault, they found him unconscious but alive, his body somehow having survived direct exposure to weapons that should have reduced him to basic organic compounds within seconds. How? Commander Varnek asked when Eli finally regained consciousness. Evolutionary compatibility. Eli whispered, his voice barely audible. I introduced genetic sequences that their weapons recognized as beneficial adaptations. They incorporated the material voluntarily, never realizing that what they thought was evolutionary advantage was actually evolutionary suicide. The Battle of the Kepler Nebula ended not with superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but with biological warfare turned against itself. For the first time in the conflict, the coalition had achieved victory not by destroying the enemy, but by understanding them better than they understood themselves. The Strategic Council Chamber had been designed to accommodate the collective intelligence of 17 different species, an architectural marvel where beings of energy could interface with organic minds, where silicon-based entities could communicate with carbon-based life forms, where the greatest tactical minds in galactic history gathered to plan the defense of civilized space. But on this day, the chamber's occupants weren't focused on alien technologies or quantum weapon systems. They were trying to understand a 25-year-old human who had somehow mastered biological warfare techniques that their most advanced artificial intelligences couldn't even categorize. Dr. Eli Monroe stood at the center of the chamber, still weak from his exposure to enemy biological weapons, but alert enough to recognize the fundamental shift in how the coalition's leadership regarded him. The contempt and dismissal that had characterized their previous interactions had been replaced by something more complex: professional respect, tinged with species-specific versions of bewilderment. Explain the countermeasure methodology, requested Admiral Thexera, whose crystalline structure resonated with harmonics that translated as intense curiosity. Our AIs cannot model the genetic sequences you utilized, because they're trying to analyze biology using mechanical principles. Eli replied, his voice carrying new confidence, born from successfully applying theoretical knowledge to practical warfare. The enemy weapons operate according to evolutionary logic, not engineering specifications. To counter them, I had to think like a biological system, rather than a computer. Commander Varnek, whose opinion of human capabilities had undergone radical revision following the Kepler Nebula engagement, leaned forward with predatory focus. I'd define thinking like a biological system in tactical terms. Evolution is fundamentally about finding solutions that work well enough to survive and reproduce. The enemy weapons were designed to adapt to any direct threat, but they weren't programmed to recognize beneficial mutations that were actually evolutionary traps. I gave them genetic material that looked like advantages, but created long-term instabilities. You poisoned their evolution, observed Captain Lyra, her Quellian background, allowing her to grasp biological concepts that other species found abstract. More precisely, I exploited their evolutionary assumptions. They had perfected adaptation to external pressures, but they had no defense against genetic modifications that appeared beneficial during initial integration, but proved catastrophic over reproductive cycles. Dr. Yenthok, the Arcturian strategy specialist whose seven-lobed brain had revolutionized coalition military doctrine, shifted his ethereal form to indicate fascination. The implications extend beyond individual weapons systems. If their entire biological network operates according to shared genetic protocols, then a countermeasure that affects their evolutionary algorithms could propagate throughout their entire military structure. Eli completed. Their greatest strength, the ability to adapt and evolve in real time, becomes their greatest vulnerability when directed against itself. The silence that followed was broken by the soft harmonic resonance that indicated deep thought processes among multiple species. Around the chamber, beings whose civilizations had conquered star systems through technological superiority found themselves confronting the possibility that their newest member species possessed strategic capabilities that transcended traditional military theory. The genetic sequences you developed, inquired the AI representative Corinth 5, whose processing matrix had been specifically enhanced for biological analysis. They demonstrate understanding of evolutionary principles that exceed our predictive models. How did a species as technologically primitive as humanity develop such sophisticated biochemical knowledge? It was the question that cut to the heart of humanity's role in galactic civilization. The Coalition had accepted humans as junior partners, useful for their adaptability and persistence, but lacking the advanced technologies that defined military relevance. The assumption had been that human contributions would be limited to manual labor and basic logistical support. "We didn't develop it," Eli said quietly. "We lived it. Every species in this chamber evolved to a point where they transcended biological limitations through technology. But humans never had that luxury. We're still biological entities, still subject to evolutionary pressures. We understand adaptation because we never stopped needing to adapt." "Are you suggesting?" Admiral Thexera's harmonic frequencies carried what might have been incredulity. "That technological primitiveness represents a strategic advantage. I'm suggesting that biological intuition is a form of intelligence that can't be programmed into artificial systems. You can model evolution mathematically, but you can't replicate the instinctive understanding that comes from actually being an evolutionary product." Lieutenant Rylus the Veltar, whose neural tendrils had initially dismissed Eli as genetically inferior, found herself reassessing everything she thought she understood about cognitive capabilities. The human perspective on biological warfare, it's not analytical, it's intuitive. Exactly. I didn't defeat their weapons through superior technology or computational power. I understood them because I recognized patterns that my own species had faced throughout evolutionary history. The enemy uses biological principles, but they use them like tools. Humans still think with biological principles. Commander Varnek, whose predatory instincts had initially marked Eli as prey, now recognized something that challenged his fundamental understanding of military hierarchy. What else can this biological intuition accomplish against enemy forces? That depends on whether you're willing to treat evolutionary biology as a legitimate military discipline, Eli replied. The enemy has other biological weapons, other evolutionary strategies that your AIs can't predict because they operate according to organic rather than mechanical logic. But if you're willing to let someone who understands biological systems analyze their patterns, you're requesting assignment to active tactical planning, observed Dr. Yenthok. I'm requesting the opportunity to demonstrate that biology is not primitive science, it's strategic intelligence that your technological civilizations have forgotten how to use. The vote that followed was unanimous across all species, present the first such consensus in the Coalition's military history. Dr. Eli Monroe was granted authority to develop biological countermeasures against enemy weapons with full access to intelligence materials and strategic planning resources. What they didn't realize was that they had just authorized humanity's first strategic contribution to galactic warfare, a contribution that would redefine how advanced civilizations understood the relationship between evolution and intelligence. The Biological Strategy Center had been constructed in the deepest levels of Coalition headquarters, in sections where environmental controls could be adjusted to accommodate research that pushed the boundaries between science and warfare. Here, surrounded by containment fields and biometric scanners, Dr. Eli Monroe worked with materials that represented the accumulated biological knowledge of civilizations that had weaponized evolution itself. But perhaps more significantly, he worked with something that no artificial intelligence could replicate: the intuitive understanding of survival that came from belonging to a species that had never transcended the biological struggle for existence. 3 months had passed since his assignment to strategic planning, and in that time, Eli had developed countermeasures for 17 different enemy biological weapons systems. Each success had built his reputation among Coalition leadership, but more importantly, each analysis had revealed patterns in enemy strategy that suggested something far more sophisticated than random biological experimentation. The enemy isn't just using evolution as a weapon development tool, he explained during his latest briefing to the Strategic Council. They're using it as a strategic philosophy. Every attack, every tactical adaptation, every weapon system follows evolutionary principles applied to warfare itself. Commander Varnek, whose respect for human capabilities had grown alongside his understanding of biological warfare, studied the holographic displays that showed enemy fleet movements across multiple star systems. Explain the implications for tactical planning. Traditional military strategy assumes that opponents make decisions based on logical analysis of strategic advantages. But evolutionary strategy operates differently. It's about survival and reproduction, not victory in conventional terms. The enemy doesn't want to win individual battles. They want to evolve superior strategies through repeated exposure to our defensive measures. They're using the war itself as a laboratory, realized Captain Lyra, her Quellian background allowing her to grasp concepts that other species found alien. Exactly. Every engagement teaches them something about our capabilities. Every countermeasure we develop becomes selective pressure that forces them to evolve more sophisticated responses. From their perspective, the war isn't about conquest, it's about achieving evolutionary superiority. Admiral Thexera's crystalline structure resonated with frequencies that indicated deep concern. If they're treating warfare as evolutionary development, then our tactical victories may actually be strengthening their strategic position. Unless we understand evolution better than they do, Eli replied, which is where humanity's biological heritage becomes strategically relevant. The silence that followed was different from the dismissive quiet that had once greeted his observations. Now, when Dr. Eli Monroe spoke about biological principles, the Coalition's greatest minds listened with the attention they would have given to weapon specifications or tactical assessments. Earth's evolutionary history is unique among Coalition species. Eli continued. Most of your civilizations developed in relatively stable environments, then transcended biological limitations through technology. But Earth produced intelligence through constant environmental pressure. Ice Age's asteroid impacts massive extinction events that forced accelerated adaptation. Humans evolved under extreme selective pressure, observed Dr. Yenthok. More than that, we evolved the ability to consciously direct evolutionary pressure. Tool use, agriculture, medicine, social organization. Humans learned to manipulate environmental factors to guide our own evolution. We became a species that could choose our own evolutionary direction. And this provides strategic advantages against enemies who use biological warfare, Commander Varnek asked. This provides strategic understanding that no artificial intelligence can replicate. I don't just analyze evolutionary patterns, I think, with evolutionary intuition that developed over millions of years of survival pressure. When I look at enemy biological weapons, I see the evolutionary compromises they made, the survival strategies they chose, the adaptive pressures that shaped their development. To demonstrate, Eli activated a holographic display showing recent enemy weapon designs. These organisms show evidence of rapid adaptation, but also evolutionary shortcuts that create strategic vulnerabilities. They've achieved impressive capabilities, but they've sacrificed genetic stability for immediate advantage. They're evolutionary sprinters rather than distance runners. Meaning, prompted Admiral Thexera, meaning they're vulnerable to countermeasures that exploit their genetic instabilities over extended time frames. I can develop biological agents that don't kill them immediately, but force them into evolutionary pathways that become unsustainable over multiple generations. You're describing biological warfare that operates across extended temporal frameworks, realized Lieutenant Rylas. I'm describing evolutionary warfare strategic thinking that operates on biological timescales rather than tactical ones. The enemy uses evolution as a weapon development tool, but they think like technologists trying to optimize systems. Humans think like organisms trying to survive impossible odds. The implications rippled through the chamber as beings whose civilizations had long since abandoned biological thinking began to understand the strategic advantages of evolutionary intuition. The Coalition possessed superior technology, more advanced artificial intelligence weapons systems that operated beyond the 3 dimensions of normal spacetime, but they had lost touch with the biological principles that govern survival under pressure. Humanity, The coalition's newest and supposedly most primitive member had retained something that advanced civilizations had forgotten: the understanding that survival was not about being stronger or smarter than your opponents, but about being more adaptable. "What do you need to develop countermeasures against their evolutionary strategies?" Varnek asked. "Permission to treat biological warfare as legitimate military science rather than primitive mysticism, access to enemy biological materials for direct analysis, and authority to develop countermeasures that operate according to evolutionary principles rather than engineering specifications." "Granted," came the unanimous response from all species present. What they had just authorized was humanity's emergence as the Coalition's biological warfare specialists, not because humans were more technologically advanced, but because they had never forgotten that intelligence itself was an evolutionary adaptation shaped by millions of years of survival pressure that no artificial system could replicate. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had just recognized that sometimes the newest members of the Alliance possessed the oldest and most fundamental forms of strategic wisdom. The final battle began not with weapons fire or tactical maneuvering, but with a revelation that redefined humanity's understanding of the conflict they had been fighting. Deep within the captured enemy vessel that Dr. Eli Monroe was analyzing, surrounded by biological technologies that represented millennia of evolutionary development, he discovered something that sent implications rippling through every strategic assumption the Coalition had made. The enemy wasn't alien at all. They were human. Or, rather, they were what humanity might have become if evolutionary pressure had driven them in radically different directions. The biological signatures were unmistakable DNA sequences that shared fundamental structures with Earth's genetic templates, protein configurations that suggested common evolutionary ancestry, cellular mechanisms that operated according to biological principles that Eli recognized from his own species. "Impossible," was Commander Varnek's initial response when Eli transmitted his analysis to the Strategic Council. "Humans have only been spacefaring for decades. These enemies have been active for centuries." "Not impossible," Eli replied, his voice carrying the weight of discovery that changed everything. "Human populations that left Earth earlier than official records indicate. Colonies that developed independently isolated populations that evolved under different selective pressures." The implications were staggering. The Coalition had been fighting a war against humanity's own evolutionary cousins, descendants of populations that had developed biological technologies instead of mechanical ones, species-level adaptations instead of artificial intelligence. They're what humans become when evolutionary pressure selects for biological superiority rather than technological development, Eli explained to the assembled council. They've weaponized their own evolution, turned their entire civilization into a living organism that adapts to survive any threat. But the discovery also provided the key to ending the conflict, because if the enemy operated according to human evolutionary principles, then Dr. Eli Monroe possessed something that no Coalition artificial intelligence could replicate: the intuitive understanding of human psychology applied to biological warfare. "They're not trying to conquer the galaxy," he announced. "They're trying to survive it. Every attack, every adaptation, every weapon system is a defensive response to what they perceive as an existential threat from technologically superior civilizations." "They fear extinction," realized Captain Lyra. "They fear genetic absorption. From their perspective, the Coalition represents technological civilizations that eliminate biological diversity through artificial enhancement and mechanical replacement of organic systems. They're not waging a war of conquest, they're fighting for the right to exist as purely biological entities." Commander Varnek's four eyes focused on Eli with predatory intensity. "How does this revelation affect tactical planning?" "It means we're fighting an enemy that operates according to survival instincts rather than strategic objectives. And survival instincts can be redirected through approaches that offer security instead of threatening extinction." What followed was the most unprecedented diplomatic initiative in galactic history: biological warfare techniques, used not to destroy an enemy, but to communicate with them. Dr. Eli Monroe, working with genetic materials that carried coded information, developed biological messages that could be transmitted through the enemy's own weapon systems. The messages were elegant in their simplicity, proof that humanity, despite joining the Coalition, had retained their biological heritage. genetic sequences that demonstrated human commitment to evolutionary diversity rather than technological absorption, biochemical arguments that offered coexistence instead of assimilation. But more importantly, the messages carried something that artificial intelligences couldn't replicate: the emotional resonance that comes from one organism recognizing another as fundamentally similar despite surface differences. The enemy response was immediate and unprecedented. For the first time in the conflict, their biological weapons didn't attack coalition positions. Instead, they established communication protocols that allowed for direct biochemical dialogue between human populations, separated by evolutionary time, but united by common genetic heritage. What emerged from those communications was an understanding that reframed the entire conflict. The enemy, who called themselves the Evolutionary Collective, had spent centuries developing biological technologies that could allow civilizations to achieve advancement without abandoning their organic nature. Their attacks on the coalition hadn't been motivated by aggression, but by the desperate need to prevent what they saw as the technological absorption of all biological diversity in the galaxy. "We fought them because we didn't understand that they were fighting for the same thing we were," Eli explained during the final strategic briefing. The preservation of biological intelligence in a universe increasingly dominated by artificial systems. The war ended not with surrender or conquest, but with recognition. The Evolutionary Collective agreed to share their biological technologies with coalition species, willing to maintain organic elements in their development. The coalition agreed to establish preservation zones where purely biological civilizations could develop without technological interference. And at the center of this unprecedented resolution stood Dr. Eli Monroe, the biologist who had been dismissed as primitive and useless, but who had possessed the one strategic capability that artificial intelligence couldn't replicate: the ability to recognize kinship across evolutionary differences. 6 months later, the Memorial of Biological Understanding was dedicated on the neutral world of Kepler 442b. The monument, grown rather than constructed using evolutionary collective biotechnology, stood as testament to the conflict that had ended when combatants realized they were fighting against, rather than for, their shared interests in biological diversity. The memorial's inscription, written in genetic code that could be read by any biological entity in the galaxy, carried a message that would guide diplomatic relations for generations. Intelligence takes many forms. Wisdom recognizes them all. But perhaps more significant than formal recognition was the fundamental change in how the galaxy understood the relationship between biological and technological development. Medical schools began teaching evolutionary psychology alongside quantum mechanics. Military academies started requiring courses in biological strategy. The coalition's universities established programs that combined artificial intelligence with organic intuition. Dr. Eli Monroe became the galaxy's first professor of biological strategy, a position that officially recognized evolutionary thinking as legitimate military science. His students came from every species in the coalition, beings who had transcended biological limitations, but needed to understand biological principles to interact with civilizations that had chosen different evolutionary paths. In the margins of official records, historians noted that the Galactic War had ended not through superior technology or strategic brilliance, but through the recognition that intelligence itself took multiple forms, and that biological intuition, even among the galaxy's most primitive species, could provide strategic capabilities that no artificial system could replicate. The galaxy had learned that progress wasn't always about transcending natural limitations. Sometimes it was about understanding those limitations well enough to use them as advantages. Commander Varnek, whose opinion of human capabilities had undergone complete revision, summarized the war's central lesson in his final report. "We assumed that biological primitiveness represented strategic weakness. We learned that evolutionary heritage provides strategic knowledge that artificial intelligence cannot replicate. The humans demonstrated that understanding nature is often more valuable than transcending it. Because in a galaxy filled with artificial intelligences and quantum processors, someone still needed to remember that intelligence itself was an evolutionary adaptation, and that the species which retained their biological heritage might possess strategic wisdom that advanced civilizations had forgotten. The war was over, the galaxy was safer, and they had achieved peace by recognizing that survival was not about being stronger than your opponents, but about understanding them well enough to offer coexistence instead of conflict. If this story reminded you that intelligence comes in many forms and that understanding often triumphs over force, then you've grasped something fundamental about survival in a complex universe. The biological principles that Dr. Eli Monroe used to end the war adaptation recognition of kinship, and the understanding that diversity strengthens rather than weakens communities. These aren't just SciFi Stories concepts. They're lessons about how different perspectives, when valued rather than dismissed, can solve problems that seem impossible from any single viewpoint. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of biological wisdom. Subscribe for more stories that explore how humanity's apparent weaknesses often become our greatest strengths, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being different doesn't mean being inferior. It means offering solutions that others never considered.